I would like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to contribute to this year's annual meeting of the China Institute of Food Science and Technology. I'm privileged to introduce to you an update on the recent developments in food allergen management. What I will try to do during this presentation is to give you the current approaches of allergen management, how they were developed at the international level and how they were adopted by a number of countries. We will review a number of levers of change. And finally, we will look together at some of the most recent developments in Codex standards related to allergens and some further perspectives for enhanced international guidance on food allergen management. Well, first of all, thinking about food allergies, this issue is a global issue, and there is an increasing number of documentations about the fact that food allergy incidents contribute to public health issues. They continue to be considered as preventable incidents, and while we are seeing a number of developments in the area of therapies to reverse these conditions, avoidance continues to be the most effective risk management approach. And we are seeing, as I mentioned in the introduction, an increased level of interest at the international level and particularly at the level of Codex in improving food allergen management. When we look at the public health impact, there is a documentation related to about 150% increase in severe allergic reactions that were documented between 2010 and 2016 in the United States. A number of other jurisdictions reported similar cases. But when we look at the impacts of food allergies, there are a number of factors and impacts that are not fully documented, and that's specifically in relation to the medical costs. So essentially, the healthcare costs associated with food allergy incidents, the social costs as well, because we know that when an individual in a family suffers from food allergies, the rest of the family generally has the impacts of that condition. The same applies to society, in daycares, in schools, where special care needs to be observed when there is a child that is suffering from these conditions. And of course, we cannot forget the psychological costs and the potential stigmatization that food allergic consumers and families may be suffering from. When we look at the interventions so far, and as I mentioned, there is so far no cure that has been fully identified as effective to reverse the condition of food allergies. And we continue to manage the risk mostly through avoidance. Avoidance meaning that those who are allergic need to avoid the ingredient to which they are proven to have this condition of sensitivity or allergy. And when it comes to managing the situations for prepackaged foods, basically the label of the food continues to be the source of information, and we need to have accurate information through the label. Consumers, in fact, depend on the information that is provided on the label to avoid the food allergen, and for those who are celiac, to avoid gluten sources. Now, generally, when we look at how labeling policies were developed, the main objective is to promote the trust in the information that is available on the food label. Essentially making sure that this information is accurate, it is complete, it is clear, and it is reliable. There shouldn't be any doubt. And that's why, in fact, in order to make sure that this measure is effective, that regulation was used to ensure that allergen labeling fulfills these objectives. And in fact, Codex standards, so the international food standards, were used for guidance to promote a good labeling of food allergenic ingredients. In fact, Codex standards were developed in the late 1990s, and in 1998 there was a standard that was adopted by Codex, and if I had to paraphrase it, it would be in this fashion. the presence of priority allergenic food should always be subject to declaration in the list of ingredients of a food label. And basically, the main issues that the food labeling standards were trying to address is situation where you have unclear information like flour or albumin or seasoning, either unclear because the word is too scientific or because essentially there is an ingredient that has the likelihood to encompass components of ingredients with allergens in them. Basically, there is the possibility of those gaps or this lack of clarity to be lifted through a mandatory requirement of labeling. So essentially, if we take that example, the way the regulation of labeling fixed that is that for flour, you would be able to identify a priority allergen that is wheat. For ovalbumin, which is the technical word for a protein that is contained in egg, well, we will be mentioning the simple word egg that is more easily recognized by food allergic consumers. This could be done directly on the ingredients list, or it could be mentioned in a contained statement that is present also on the food label. And in fact, what Codex did was that it established a priority list of allergens that we call the priority allergens, and this list was in fact subject to the mandatory declaration. Of course, Codex also recognized the fact that dietary habits can be different. We have different diets, we have also different prevalence in food sensitization, and therefore this list can vary. And Codex directed one of its expert bodies, that is JECFA, the Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives, to develop criteria for the acceptance and the identification of priority allergens that would be subject to this mandatory declaration. Now, of course, in 20 years, this Codex standard was adopted in a number of national legislation or regulation, and a number of countries basically moved to have allergen labeling requirements as part of their mandatory labeling provisions. And we're seeing the propagation of these measures throughout the world. We're seeing progress also being expected in various parts of the world, including China, the Middle East and North Africa, and the Caribbean region in the upcoming period. Now, while significant progress has been made in the labeling of ingredients, we are seeing, however, an area that requires more interest and more focus, and that's the way precautionary statements are being used. So these precautionary statements, these are what we call the may contain statements, are used on food allergic ingredients. And this is an example of a misuse of these precautionary statements. We have a very simple food. Basically, it's a barbecue chicken. And we see here that while the list of ingredients contains 2 ingredients, chicken and salt, we're seeing that there is a may contain statement with all series of food allergens. And for the most part, when we look at this label, we consider that this list was not necessarily established with a good justification. So we are seeing, in fact, that as a result, because allergen precautionary statements are overused, we are seeing, in fact, that consumers are ignoring them, and we are seeing, in fact, that there is a higher risk for allergic consumers because they are potentially taking risks by consuming products with an allergen. Now, there was a renewed interest on the part of the Codex Alimentarius Commission in the late 2018-2019 with the acceptance of new work that led to the development of a code of practice on food allergen management that was achieved by the Codex Committee on Food Hygiene, supported by the review of the Codex Committee on Food Labeling. This is meant to be a guidance document that could be followed by food business operators in order to give them ideas about how policies, procedures, and protocols could be developed and adopted for the identification of allergens as an important food hazards and to dedicate specific control measures for this hazard. Specifically to look at avoiding or managing or mitigating cross-contact, the possibility of the identification of instances of undeclared allergens, paying special attention to the accuracy of food labeling, but also to provide accurate and useful information to consumers. What this guidance also advocates is the necessity to base these control measures as part of good hygiene practices or as part of a hazard analysis and critical control point approach using a risk assessment approach. So essentially, those measures that could lead to the development of an allergen precautionary statement need to be supported by risk assessment, and that these approaches of management need to be effective, proactive, and meant specifically to reduce the risk for allergic consumers. Basically, this guidance looked really at various aspects of food production and various steps in food production. Looked at specific issues that could be encountered by primary production, the need to look at the way facilities are designed, how operations could be controlled, how sanitation measures need to be adapted to the issue of allergen management. Looked also at the issues of personal hygiene, transportation, any type of information that needs to be provided to consumers, but also any type of training that needed to be focused and dedicated to the issue of the management of allergens, and that needs to be dedicated and devoted to the personnel of these food production establishments. Now, as a result, in fact, of this added interest, we have seen the adoption of this text at the last Codex Alimentarius Commission, so the 43rd session of Codex, and this is now an adopted text. But at the same time, we have uncovered a number of areas that will require continued attention. First of all, these risk assessment approaches that are advocated by this text, well, there is a lack of guidance on the methodologies that need to be followed by the food industry in this regard, but also the availability of data that could be used in the context of these risk assessments, and also the possibility of providing some advisory action levels that could be followed by certain production sectors. There was also a concurrence on the part of Codex that more scientific advice is needed, and specifically in the area of reviewing priority allergens, but also reviewing the clinical information that supports risk assessment, in particular in the area of threshold development. And in fact, Codex also agreed to continue work in the area of allergen management, and particularly looking at new work, now this time dedicated to have guidance on the use of precautionary allergen or advisory labeling, and this was discussed by the Codex Committee on Food Labeling. Now, of course, Codex work will not be happening in a vacuum, but rather will be supported by 2.5 decades worth of work that was initiated not only by a number of regulatory agencies, but also by the food production sector. And what is worth mentioning here is the work that was conducted by the Allergen Bureau in Australia through its effort to develop guidance documents that can be useful by or to the food production sector, primarily on how to use the results of allergen testing and how these results could be incorporated in a risk-based approach that may lead to the decision of adopting certain labeling practices, particularly for the adoption of precautionary statements. A number of challenges, however, continue to remain and need to be subject to further attention. While guidance documents, protocols and procedures are developed for better management for allergen control. We are not sure about the adaptability of these guidance documents to small businesses, to small and medium enterprises that constitute the largest proportion of the food production sector. And we need also to evaluate the effectiveness of the policies of allergen labeling over the past 3 decades on reducing the risk, and particularly on the reduction of both the high impact incidents, so essentially those that are leading to emergency room visits, but also to the reduction of food recalls. Now, we're seeing lots of levers of change that are making us optimistic. First of all, consumer groups continue to be very interested in this issue and are advocating for more progress and for more enhancement in allergen management. We're seeing that food allergen labeling, certainly for ingredients, has become a known and applied requirement across the world. We're seeing more and more preventive controls dedicating more attention to allergens as a particular hazard that is witnessed in food. We're also seeing developments that are quite promising in the area of cure, and particularly the application of immunotherapies that could be useful to reverse these situations of food allergies. And industry is becoming more and more educated and aware, and also this is leading to the propagation of a number of policies to protect food allergic consumers in a number of public spaces. Now, if we project ourselves in the future, we're seeing changes in the way food labeling is being developed, is being applied by the food industry and by consumers. And we're going to be seeing very soon the use of the Internet of Things, our smart objects that are used in order to provide us with the information that is needed on the composition of a food product or even on its condition of production. And therefore, there is a potential for using these intelligent tools to provide us with a personalized reading of labeling information. Personalized, basically this information will be customized to the state, to the health status of the consumer, and providing therefore a direct advice as to the suitability of the food product, in particular vis-a-vis a particular food allergy. And we're seeing more and more the development of consensus around the adoption of these risk-based management approaches of food allergens, and hopefully a better use of the results of allergen testing in the context of validating the effectiveness of sanitation measures or of preventive controls. And in application of these validation efforts, we will see how food labeling can become more accurate and more effective, and therefore more trustworthy by allergic consumers. We are hopeful that this momentum that has been further reignited as a result of the interest of Codex in more allergen-related work, that this will lead to safer products, to better protection of food allergic consumers, and hopefully to no longer seeing any documentation of fatal food allergy incidents for consumers around the world. I hope that this offered you a good perspective in terms of what has been emerging in the area of food allergen management, and particularly in where Codex has developed significant improvement and significant progress, and where the future direction is going to be. And again, thankful to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to contribute, and I'm going to wish you a great meeting.